Hi, my name is Morgan Bowers. I'm Bat Care Coordinator for Brumbats.
Hi, my name's Chris Sherlock. I'm the Training Officer for Brumbats.
And Brumbats is the Birmingham and Black Country Bat Group, and we are located in the middle of England.
So it's May 2014 at the moment, and we're talking about an introduction to bat care. This is aimed at people who are thinking about taking up the hobby of bat care alongside the Birmingham Black Country Bat Group, but it would also be suitable for people in other places, but particularly in a UK context, who are thinking about volunteering with their local bat group to support bat care in their area.
Chris and I have both been volunteering for Brumbats in several different capacities. Chris for a lot longer than me, and we really hope that this will encourage you to get involved either with us or with your local bat group, either doing bat care or some other kind of volunteering.
So this is an outline of the course, what we're going to cover in this podcast, what is bat care and the legal stuff.
And then I'm going to talk about equipment, basically what kind of stuff that you need to start doing bat care, a bit about how our network works, which will probably be similar to how a lot of bat care networks work.
And then finally, we're going to talk about the actual process of the first level of volunteering complexity, which would be somebody who was going to pick up a bat from a householder where a bat needs rescuing. Maybe an ambulance driver role would be a way of thinking about it, and delivering it to a more experienced bat carer. What is bat care? It's really a piece of string, in as much as you can end up being extremely involved in bat care and spend an awful lot of your time doing it, or you can have a relatively light role but one that supports bat carers who are doing the more complex things. First level might be collecting and transporting an injured or grounded bat from where it's been found to somebody who's going to look after it more for the bat group. That's going to involve a certain amount of caring for the bat in a very early stage of giving first aid. You might also need to feed that bat if you're perhaps looking after it overnight before somebody else takes it from you. If you're going to be looking after the bat more long term, then you'll certainly need to be feeding and watering the bat. Sick bats often have parasites on them, particularly if they're young. So there's going to be a process perhaps of removing nasties from the bat. So you need to consider that in terms of what you can stomach. Bats often need medication, for example, antibiotics, rehydration type solutions, that kind of thing. Rearing baby bats, which we refer to as bat pups, is a particularly specialist area and something that Morgan does a great deal of and has more experience than I do. Rehabilitating bats, that's usually about bats that have been grounded for whatever reason, perhaps with an injury or due to weather conditions. They need some looking after, and then rather wonderfully they can go back to the wild and carry on doing their thing. In Brumbats we also now have a flight cage which we use for rehabilitating bats who might need extra time to get back to good flying skills. And finally, if you don't want to do anything else, then you can breed mealworms, which we can then feed to the bats. So that would be a good thing to do as well. This slide looks in more detail at the roles in bat care and the different levels of complexity. Somebody who collects bats might give first aid to a bat when they've collected it, perhaps within the home of the person where you've collected it from, but perhaps also in your own home once you get it back there. Give advice to the finder, so that might be a householder who's found a bat either in their house or in their garden, or that their cat's brought in. And there are some legal issues around that, and some issues around what to advise them if they've got more than one bat that this has happened to. Then ambulance driving, taking bats to a carer, sometimes having bats overnight if there's nobody available. It can get very busy at certain times of the year, particularly in June and July, and it may be at that point that your local bat carer isn't able to take in a bat at that precise time, and you may need to look after it for a little while longer. The other rather lovely bit of all of this is that you know where that bat came from. So it might be that it would be you that would return with that bat once it's rehabilitated to that address to let it go again back into the wild in somebody's garden. And that's the particularly lovely bit of all of this. The next role, the next level of complexity would be bat carer. You'd be taking in bats from ambulance drivers, possibly picking them up from places like vets, those kind of things, giving that bat an assessment and longer term care based on its needs, medication, treatment, removal of ectoparasites, so that's parasites in the fur or on the wings of the bat, on the outside of the bat, nothing nasty and insidey. Cleaning wounds, which Morgan does, and can be a bit gruesome. Hand feeding where necessary, and often bats when they come in aren't very keen on or don't know how to feed the kind of food that we give them, so then there is quite a complicated fiddly bit of work to be done to get them so that they know how to do that for themselves. Hand rearing pups is a very sophisticated aspect of this work, involves mixing milk, doing it at the right times, 2-hourly feeds, that kind of thing. It's a really big deal. The bats that you've got in care, you may need to further rehabilitate them in terms of their flying skills and how they're managing in a semi-wild environment. That would involve working in the flight cage. Sadly, also, this can involve euthanasia or taking bats to someone who will do that, either your vet or somebody in the bat group who's willing to do that. Morgan and I would do that, although that's obviously after a period of assessment and decision making. It's not something that we do straight away. Mealworm breeder, that's somebody who develops the colonies of mealworms, which are a beetle larvae, to provide food for the bats. All British bats are insectivorous, and so we need insects that we can manage and handle and feed to the bats. So we need somebody who can do those because they're relatively expensive, and bats, when they're underweight, can actually eat quite a lot being 30 or 40 mealworms a day. And then finally, flight cage volunteer. So we've got the flight cage in the West Midlands. There are other bat groups around the UK that also have flight cages, and there's work to do if the bats are there, rehabilitating, adjusting to ordinary weather conditions, to assist with making sure the bats are fed, watered, safe, not doing each other any harm, not got hurt in some way. So that daily routine includes checking all the bats, making sure we've still got them, checking that they're well, looking at factors such as temperature, whether they've got food and water, and then planning what it is that we're going to do to release those bats back into the wild, either once they're flying well, then back to where they came from, or a soft release process, which is where we can't return them to where they came from, and they need to go gradually back to the wild once they're sure that they can do the things that they need to do, like feeding themselves on the wing.
I think it's also worth saying as well that if you don't feel that you could take on the role of being a full-blown bat carer, you shouldn't by any means think that being a bat collector, a flight cage volunteer or a mealworm breeder is just small change, because it really isn't. The time-consuming stuff, the dealing with the public, that the kind of role that a bat collector does just takes that workload off of the bat carers and allows them to sort of give more time and attention to the bats. And mealworm breeders, basically, I think we figured out that last year, 2013, we got through 80,000 mealworms. So people who can have the space and the time and the inclination to breed food for our bats can not only are doing something to support the bats themselves, but can save the bat group an awful lot of money.
Yeah, those things are really important. I get home from work, I can't take bat calls in the day. I work in the NHS, I get home, there's an answer phone message from some poor desperate person trying to get some help for a bat that they've found. If I know that perhaps that I can get somebody more local to them to pick it up because I've already got bats in care, or that in fact somebody has already picked it up and they're on their way to me at 6 o'clock in the evening, then that's a very helpful thing to know. It's very comforting and it does make the work easier.
Yeah, and often when we get bat calls and people have had the bat in their house already in a cardboard box for maybe 2 or 3 days, so the sooner we can get someone to that bat to pick it up and assess it, the better.
One of the reasons for offering this course online, perhaps before people come to join us for a face-to-face course, is for an opportunity for you to think about whether back care is actually for you, and to learn a bit more about it and then reflect before you actually get yourself embroiled in this. And it's very fair to say that back care is not for everyone. There are plenty of people out there who are doing very valuable bat-related conservation work who never go anywhere near any back care, perhaps because their group doesn't get themselves involved in that in general, but also perhaps because it really isn't something that everybody wants to do, because it can be quite emotionally draining and upsetting. Quite often the bats that we have are badly hurt, it looks distressing, and then the bat either needs to be euthanized or dies. However, over the last few years we have an improved success rate, and Morgan can tell you more about that.
Yeah, we've had, there was a time when there was only a couple of us doing bat work, and I think that our success rate is down to a few different things, that we have more bat carers, and we can give more time to each individual bat. The fact that there's been in the last few years some improvements in the types of puppy formula that's available, which is what we feed to bat pups, which has helped a lot. It's more nutritionally balanced and closer to what they actually need, although we could never really replicate it perfectly. And also because of giving antibiotics to bats, which we found has been really great for us and has improved the percentage rate of success that we get.
A few years ago there was a presentation at National Bat Conference where somebody who was an experienced bat carer looked back at her success rate of returning bats to the wild, flying, feeding themselves, hopefully breeding, and she was getting about a 30% success rate, probably because she wasn't using antibiotics that much, and many of the bats that we get in for care are cat damaged, and that's where the antibiotics can really play a part. So Morgan's success rate over the last 2 or 3 years of more like 50% returning to the wild shows what a difference those sort of things are making, and perhaps shows that things can get even more positive. We shouldn't stay being too overly confident, because these things can still be very upsetting, and you will need to get used to the fact that the bats that you care for will die. The other aspect of bat care, making it not for everyone, particularly if you have got lots of other demands on your time, is that it can take a considerable amount of time to do. Even having one bat at home in a box is going to take you some time, particularly if that bat needs hand feeding, particularly if it's very underweight or is very young, then that's going to take you around about 45 minutes, even for an adult bat, 2, 3, even 4 times a day perhaps. So before you go to work, as soon as you get home from work, later on in the evening, and perhaps also before bedtime. The bat will need to be kept clean, so there's a certain amount of washing, cleaning, moving paper or whatever it is that you've got in the box to put fresh in. Bat that's in active rehabilitation is going to need flight practice, so a bat that's reluctant to fly is going to need several goes at flying. That takes a while. If a bat's really flying well, then the bat may fly for 30 minutes or so before it lands. You're just going to have to wait for it to land before you can stop that work and get on with something else. There's driving, there's to collect bats or to take them back or to take them to somebody else, and then there's the driving to release a bat, and that's got to be at the right time of evening. So if it's when we've got long light evenings in the summer, you might be driving half an hour, 40 minutes to release a bat well after sunset, so you've got to be there at about 10 o'clock, for example. It's dark enough, then release the bat, which can take a while. They need to warm up, make sure it's really gone, possibly talk to the householder if they've been involved, and then come back and then think about what you're going to do in the morning. If you need to go to work and you're not getting home until getting on for 11:30 or something, then you need to factor that in. So we talked about some of the issues around why you might think about bat care for yourself, but we need to think about whether bat care is actually worth doing for the bats, why we might do that, given that there's a significant emotional investment and turmoil for the person or persons doing it, a relatively poor success rate, 50% isn't that great, and it is because of the nature of the injuries and things that the bats get. And for some bat groups, there is a financial outlay which may be more than the bat group can support. And if you're doing this and it's a hobby, then there's going to be a financial outlay for you. And whereas in some roles in bat work, there is a way of getting money back for your petrol or other things that you purchase, this isn't always possible in bat care, depending on the circumstances of your bat group. People are often quite generous in donations when you go and pick a bat out from them, and that can help, but obviously that's money that you would then use directly for the bat rather than to recompense yourself. So you might wonder why we take on any bat care at all. One of the key things is that it's good public relations for bats, that there are people out there who care about bats, are willing to do the rescue work, actually puts bats in a much better light for people. When we turn up and we're positive about them and we're going to do something positive for them, that can be very thought changing for the people that we meet. There's a certain amount of bat conservation in bat rescue, not directly in terms of conserving good population numbers for bats by the single bats that we collect and return to the wild, but rather that by visiting a house where we might discover that there's a bat roost, we can actually work with that householder then to conserve that entire population of bats, which might be 20, 30, 40, could even in certain parts of the country go into the hundreds depending on the species of bat. And then by collecting and rescuing one bat, you can make very positive differences for the conservation of the whole group of bats. Bats that we have in care often have to earn their crust by, if they're well enough and up to it, going on educational visits with us, so going to a bat talk and being shown to people, doing school visits, and meeting a bat can really change how people feel about them, because they actually see then that the bat is fluffy, unthreatening, not huge, not about to suck blood from their necks, those kind of things. That can be very important. Also, it allows a bat group to reach out and give public relations advice and information about the sort of things that we do, so that we may get further members or extra donations, or people being more positive about bats in a national and international sense.
Another thing that you might want to do to get an idea of the kind of the ups and downs of bat care is to take a look at the Brumbats webpage, which is www.brumbats.org.uk. On the main landing page of that website, you will find a blog, and the blog will include all different kinds of things, from surveys to public events, National Bat Conference. But one of the things that it does have an awful lot of is blog posts by myself and by Chris and by a lot of our other bat carers and trainee bat carers, just basically to give you an idea of what an experience is like training to be a bat carer and caring for bats. And we do, we don't sugarcoat it. We do include some of the negative things that happen as well, bats not surviving, but you'll also see a few videos here and there about bat releases and things like that, and how things are going at the flight cage.
There are some legal aspects to bat work in general, which I'm sure you'll learn more about if you start to get more involved in bat work. And we need to take those very seriously into account in this situation. But The flip side of that is that anyone can care for a wild animal in distress without coming into conflict with the law, because it's more important that that animal has its distress eased or ended, rather than that we are very careful about how we're managing any licences to do bat work or to work with any other protected species. So the 18 species of bats that we have in the UK are protected under UK and European law. The European law is interpreted in British law under the Conservation of Habitats and Species Regulations 2010, and that applies in England, and there will be other versions for Scotland and Northern Ireland. It also applies as it applies in England in Wales. The key piece of legislation for the protection of endangered wildlife in the UK is the Wildlife and Countryside Act 1981, and that's the legislation that oversees licences for work with protected species, and that would include bats, but also other things like otters, badgers, and birds and plants and things are also protected by that legislation. However, as I say, a grounded, sick, trapped, injured bat can be rescued by anybody. So that means that the householder can do that without them being in any way getting into any trouble. Bats that we have to rescue are grounded, so they're on the ground, found in a back garden, that kind of thing. Sick, perhaps for reasons that we don't ever really find out, but that's what makes them land on the ground, because they're ill. Trapped in a room, for example, if they've thrown in through a window by mistake. Injured, often because they have been caught by a cat. Although I did have a bat last year that I think broke its neck by flying into a conservatory window, because it was in a garden where there were ultrasound cat scarers, and I think perhaps some movement, maybe not of the bat but of the plant, caused the ultrasound to fire off as the bat entered the garden, which jammed its echolocation, caused it to fly into the conservatory window and break its neck. It was dead when I collected it, obviously. So when you go to somebody's house to collect a bat, or to a site, a building or a school or a church or whatever, to collect a bat that needs your care, you need to make sure that the problem is not as a result of a bat crime, a wildlife crime under the Wildlife and Countryside Act 81. That might be, for example, because a roof is being removed without inspections having carried out before, and found the bats there, so not the roof then not being taken off. That would expose the bats, mean that they needed rescuing, and would mean that a crime had been committed because their roost had been disturbed and the bats have been disturbed, and you need to know what to do if you were to turn up to that kind of situation. When we've got bats in our care for the alleviation of this distress, then we can keep them for as long as is need be for their first aid and rehabilitation. But if we're keeping that bat for over 6 months, which it is conceivable that we would do if they were a pup and they weren't ready for release in the autumn, before the winter came, when they would remain in care over the winter to be released in the spring, or perhaps from the brumbat's point of view, and the very unlikely event that we would keep a bat more permanently in captivity to use it for educational purposes, then if you're the person caring for that bat, then you need a licence to have it for more than 6 months. You'd be licensed by Natural England under the Wildlife and Countryside Act to do that. Finally, you're obliged to keep any animal that you care for safely and appropriately. It would be cruel to do otherwise and would lay you open to prosecution, and that might be until such time as you can get more expert help to care for that bat. So let's just run over some of the basic legislation here. Can't say that Morgan and I have ever read these in any great detail, but we're taking the gist of it. So some other relevant legislation over and above the Wildlife and Countryside Act, the Abandonment of Animals Act 1969, we take that to mean that if an animal is in distress, in pain, then it's wrong to leave it. You need to do something about it, even if it's euthanasia. But the other side of that is that we take the responsibility of caring for an animal in a cage in our homes also very seriously. So in the same way as people get prosecuted for neglect and mistreatment of a dog, if you were to leave a bat without access to food and water, or too hot or too cold in your home, then that would be where people could start to ask very serious questions of what you've done.
Yeah, I think another aspect of that is not undertaking a bat release unless you feel confident that that bat can survive once it's been released back into the wild.
And not doing it on a really terrible night.
Yeah.
Because it might be, down in the snow when you've turned your back, mightn't it? Okay, transport of animals. As you can see on the picture, in the collecting and transportation box there, that's not the kind of box that you would want to keep a bat in for any length of time, but it is a very suitable box for collecting a bat in when transporting it in your car, potentially on the bus or the train, although you'd probably put it inside another bag as long as there was enough air, so that you can transport it safely. And in that situation, it's really important that you put information on that box so that in the event of an accident and you're not able to care for that bat, then somebody else would know what to do, know where it had come from, how to get further help. So it needs to say on it what animal it is, at least bat, but the species is good, where it's come from and the date, so that somebody knows how long it's been in care. That's harking back to that piece of legislation and licensing about not having a bat in your care for longer than 6 months unless you're licensed. Contact details for somebody to get more help, and we've got This Way up on it because bats don't all hang upside down, so it is important, perhaps in the event of an accident, to know what to do to help that bat be as safe and as comfortable as possible. If you had more than one bat in there as well, that would be really important in case something happened and then you could only find one, and then you'd know there was another one to look for. The final bit of legislation is around protecting professional boundaries, really, and also protecting animals from people messing about with them when they don't know what they're doing. Only vets can actually treat animals and advise you how to treat animals with drugs or perform surgery on them. So that's very important. We're not in the area of doing things to the bats other than that's what's on the outside, and we can see what really obviously easily needs to be done for first aid, keeping it within the realms of the legislation. There are some significant considerations around health and safety for you as the bat worker when it comes to bat work, and we need to remember that you are the most important thing when you're collecting and caring for a bat. It's not good PR for bats for somebody to get hurt or injured or even worse when they're caring for a bat. There's enough negative concepts and ideas out there around bats without adding some ghastly headline to it. So the most important thing is that you can collect a bat and care for it, and then you can collect and care for another bat and another one and another one. So don't do anything that's going to compromise that. You're not insured by anyone when collecting a bat. Bat Group can't afford that kind of cover, and although there are some aspects of bat work volunteering that are insured, this isn't one of them, and so you're working under your own car insurance and your own common sense for not doing anything that's going to get you into a difficult situation. So don't do anything that you're uncomfortable about. Don't go into somebody's house if you don't have a good feeling about it. Do take somebody with you. If you're having to drive to an area that you're not happy with or you don't know, then don't do it. Okay, it might be that a bat doesn't actually make it to release and success because of this, but that's one bat. And there are other things we can do about bat conservation. It's really bad news if a bat worker gets harmed in these kind of processes. Things specifically maybe to think about if you go into somebody's house, so you're not working at height, so you're not climbing up something to get a bat down. If that's needed, then we're going to have to do something much more significant. You're going to need to get much more help and advice, and don't go into confined spaces. There isn't a legal definition of a confined space, because for one person's confined space is another person's vast cathedral. So don't go into anywhere that you're not happy about, but particularly don't go into rooms or houses or garages or sheds or anything like that where you think that you might be under threat from another person who might shut you in there, or a chemical in there, or an unsafe floor, or a dog, or anything. That at that point, just if you've sussed it out and you haven't even gone anywhere near it, not even rung the doorbell, that's okay. But at that point, it's still absolutely fine to say, I don't want to go in there. Either could you bring the bat to me, or I'm leaving now and I'll think about what to do next. I'll get some more help if need be. It's just not worth it. Please don't do it. Carrying on from that point about don't do something that you're not happy with, we need to think in a little more detail about lone working. There is a good chance that you, as a bat collector or bat carer, would be going into a situation on your own in the dark. So you're going to somebody's house, or you're going back to somebody's house with a bat to release, and we need you to think very carefully about how you're going to do that, because you're the most important thing. So don't go alone if you can help it. You don't have to take somebody who likes bats, you just have to take somebody who likes you. So even if they just come with you and sit in the background during the process, but they're there to make sure that you're all right. Go in a posse. Risk assess over the phone. So if you really don't like the sound of the person on the other end, or you think they might be drunk or something else, then you don't have to go. It's okay. You can politely make your apologies and we'll sort something else out. Or maybe that one has to go by the by. I've often asked people who I thought were on their own, if I was going there, to invite a neighbour in so that they weren't on their own, because they might be worried about you as well. And if people are tense, then that can make things go a bit wrong a bit more quickly. Other things that I've done are to make sure that somebody absolutely knows where I'm going and when I'll be back. So that's onto the phone buddy thing. So somebody's knows where you are, has the name and address and phone number. They've not come with you, but you let them know when you get to the house, and then when you're out and when you're in the car ready to set off, perhaps when you've just driven around the corner a little bit so that you're not sat outside somebody's house, and then again when you're home. Phones don't always have signals, and you need to have a plan with your phone buddy about what they're going to do if they haven't heard from you by 10:20 or whatever the agreed time is. And that might be that they're going to call the police or whatever, but you need a plan. Have a clear idea where you're going. So it's all right to rely on sat-nav and those kind of things, but they don't always work. You need to know where you're going from a map. I've got a route planned in your head so that you're not then driving around in the dark, not knowing where you're going, possibly distracted, putting yourself at more of risk of having an accident in the car, those kind of things. Don't go into a property unless you're really comfortable with it. So if you turn up, you don't like the look of it, don't do it. I did a bat call to collect a bat from a household that was absolutely in the middle of nowhere, up a lane that was blocked off at one end by enormous concrete bollards. And there was lots of half dismantled cars in the yard and those kind of things. It wasn't the sort of home that I was used to visiting. It made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. It was probably my prejudice. They were actually lovely people, but I got them to bring the bat out to me rather than going into the house. Reverse park, so that means that you can make a quick getaway. So put your car in a place that means that you can do that easily. And then we would really encourage you to reflect on and find out more about lone working. Whatever your gender, even if you're a big burly bloke, you need to think about this stuff. So there's stuff on our website. Susie Lamplugh Trust have really, really good training on their website. Lots of advice, lots of things to consider. Susie Lamplugh was a estate agent, a young woman estate agent in London in the 1980s. She did a visit on her own to meet a client at a house and was never seen again. Nobody ever found a body or anything. Her mum set up a trust to campaign on these issues in her memory, and eventually became a DAME, I think, at least an OBE. And so they've got a lot of really important information on their website that you can look at and to think about. The other big deal about bats, and something that you might have already heard about, is that bats do carry rabies internationally and even in the UK, although we're still a rabies-free nation, the way that it's recognised. It's not classical rabies in the way that we think about it perhaps in literature, in the sort of foaming at the mouth, running away from water kind of idea that's associated more with dogs and foxes, particularly feral dogs in Southeast Asia, India, those kind of places, where actually there's a lot more risk to you if you travel from a rabies point of view. But European bat lyssavirus type 2 is a form of rabies that's species specific to bats in Europe. There are at least 17 different sorts of lyssavirus internationally found in bats. It's possible that bats are the originating animal for this set of diseases. Rabies is a notifiable disease in the UK. That means that the government has to know if somebody or some animal has got it, because it's such a dangerous disease, and control will be need to put in place if somebody or something is found to have it. I think that's also applies to measles as well, so it's one of those special diseases. EBLV is very rare in UK bats, but it is present in about 4% of Daubenton's bats. And when bats are found that then turn out to have EBLV type 2, those bats aren't showing classical signs of rabies of the sort that I've already described. They're just poorly bats, lethargic, those kind of things. And at that point they're at the end of their illness and soon to die, but obviously very infectious. And bats can live with this disease in them and be absolutely fine, whereas other mammals can't. In the past, we have had a bat worker die in 2002 in the UK from rabies, and that was not good PR for bats, and we do find that people do sometimes still remember that. And so that's something very important for us to counteract, to make people understand the level of risk involved in finding and caring for a bat or having bats living in your home, because there's very little risk to people, but we need to control for that and to make sure that people have good information and advice about that. As a bat worker, you're protected by your standard rabies vaccination. It's the same sort as you would have if you were travelling, and that protects you from EBLV. It's a close enough disease that ordinary rabies vaccinations will protect you. Other things that protect you are your bat identification skills. So know your bats, and particularly know what a Daubenton's bat looks like, because if that's something that comes into care with you, then you're going to need to know straight away that that's what you've got, and therefore be extra careful. And there are some things to consider from the point of view of the people that found the bat. Wearing gloves is very important because this is a saliva and other body fluids transmitted disease, so that the gloves are there to protect you. First aid, so that's what to do if you're bitten by a bat or you think that a body fluid from the bat has got into you through a scratch or a cut, and then what to do if you think you've been bitten by a bat after that. So there are protocols and information and systems and organisations out there to help advise, support when there is a bat bite of a human or another animal, so somebody's cat or whatever. These are the Bat Conservation Trust, the Animal Health Veterinary Laboratories Agency, and in England, Public Health England, which is the organisation that looks after things like notifiable disease. They all have systems and protocols and can support you if there has been the possibility of an infection from a bat. And that would be any bat, but obviously particularly it would need to be put into place if you thought or were sure that a bat involved in a bite was a Daubenton's bat. With regard to EBLV type 2, you're more likely to be needed to identify a bat that has bitten someone else, and that would be a role that would probably be given to an experienced bat carer who's on the list for the Bat Conservation Trust for that role. ID skills are going to be needed in order to check that what sort of bat it is that might have bitten somebody or bitten a pet. The worry is that if you or somebody else is bitten, or body fluids such as blood from an injury on a bat was to get into a cut or a graze on you and no action was taken, then if that bat was positive for EBLV type 2, then ultimately there would be a fatal outcome. And you wouldn't get sick for days or even weeks, but you wouldn't want to in any way delay treatment for yourself or somebody else, because the treatment needs to be very much as soon as possible. And I'm afraid the treatment is more injections, folks.
But it is better to be safe than sorry.
It is, because the outcome of that is, as far as we know, 100% effective. Nothing can be genuinely 100% effective, but everybody who's been bitten by a Daubenton's bat in the UK and has quickly got the extra vaccinations has been absolutely fine, and that's included people who were pregnant at the time. So, and they didn't have any symptoms, no problems with having those vaccinations. You get a bit of a sore arm, but that's it. Hygiene's also important, so better be safe than sorry, as Morgan's saying. So things like always wearing your gloves, being very careful with cleaning out cages, those kind of things. Perhaps wearing 2 layers of gloves, gloves that protect you from biting, but also gloves that then protect you from fluids underneath might be important, particularly if you've got a Daubenton's bat. The important thing is to be seen to be wearing gloves when you're handling bats and handling safely at all times. So even in your own home, you need to think about what you're doing. When you're collecting a bat from somebody, then if you're handling it, wear gloves, because it might be a household where they get bats relatively regularly, and they need to see and remember what's best practice. If you're sharing photographs of a bat, then you need to be seen to be wearing gloves in that. If you're showing family and friends a bat that you have got in your care at the time, or you're doing an educational visit or whatever, then if there is a need to actually handle a bat rather than somebody looking through the side of a cage, then you need to be wearing gloves at that time.
I think it's also worth mentioning at this point that it's also beneficial for the bats that if you are, say, a lot of times we will use disposable gloves between bats, for the purposes of ensuring that anything that is on one bat doesn't get transferred to another bat, be that diseases or just gubbins that stuck to them and things like that. And we should also say that for those of you who are in our area and thinking about becoming a carer for brumbats, gloves are something that we would provide for you.
Before you do any work with bats, if you're going to be handling them, which you would in a bat collection and care role, then you should get your prophylactic, your preventative, your before you do anything vaccinations. That's 3 shots, same as if you were going on holiday to a country where rabies is prevalent, and then after that you get boosters every 3 to 5 years, depending on the advice at the time, and also it can be on the basis of levels of immunity in your blood based on blood tests. If you get bitten, then you're going to have more shots after that. The prophylactic shots should be free, and certainly if you're bitten or if a householder has been bitten, then those shots that have to be done very quickly will definitely be free. If you get bitten, then you have shots rather than waiting for your boosters, so you have them right away, and you need to sort that out with your GP or your local hospital emergency department. All of the information and legislation about this is written up in a thing called the Green Book, which is something that GPs and other doctors have access to, and all the stuff about bats and bat workers and rabies and stuff is all in Chapter 27. If you're going to be on a nationally held list of people who are recognised as being willing to go and rescue bats, so those lists held by the Bat Conservation Trust, and for other voluntary roles around bats also held by Natural England, then you're going to need to send a copy of your form demonstrating that you have actually had your vaccination, so effectively signed and stamped by your GP, to them for their records to prove that you have been vaccinated, and that therefore in their risk assessments then that they can ask you to go and perform this voluntary role. Bat Conservation Trust can provide information for general practitioners about why injections are needed, because sometimes GPs can be difficult about this because they struggle to understand the volunteer role and worry about money and those kind of things. On some occasions where people have really struggled, we've provided a letter for somebody's GP, but that can also come from Bat Conservation Trust. I think, Morgan, you found some difficulties with this, didn't you?
Yeah, I eventually sort of gave up in desperation and paid for at the travel clinic for my vaccinations. But I have a new doctor now, so I'm hoping she'll be nicer about my next booster.
And my GPs were absolutely lovely about it. And when I went to the nurse for the injections and stuff, she wanted to hear all about what I'd been up to with the bats. So it varies enormously.
It varies a lot, yeah. I think, I've in the last year, I've had one potential trainee had issues with their GP, but the rest have been fine.